How Theosophy Came to Me by C.W. Leadbeater, Chapter 6. Our last chapter ended with my meeting with Madame Blavatsky at a hotel at Port Said, where I fondly expected that we might wait in peace until our steamer arrived. I did not know Madame Blavatsky as well then as I came to do later, or I should probably have felt less sanguine. I engaged a bedroom and hunted out a few score mosquitoes from inside the curtains of its bed, and was already looking forward with pleasure to the idea of settling down for the night. Soon after darkness fell, however, Madame Blavatsky had one of those sudden flashes of inspiration which so frequently came to her from the inner side of things. She usually attributed them to one or other of those whom she called the brothers, a term under which she included not only some of the brothers, but also a number of their disciples. In this case, the hint which she received completely upset all our plans, and she was instructed that instead of waiting quietly for our steamer, we were to post off immediately to Cairo, where we should obtain some information that would be of great use to her in dealing with the treacherous servants, the Coulombs. Coulombs. In those days, there were no railway running from Port Said, and the only way in which we could reach Cairo was by traveling down the Suez Canal as far as Ismailia, Ismailia, whence we could take the train to the capital. The journey down the canal was performed in a tiny little steamer, somewhat like a tugboat, which was dignified with the name of the Khedive's packet boat. I'll spell Khedive's here. Khedive. Every night it left Port Said at midnight and reached Ismailia on the following morning. In spite of its high-sounding name, it was perhaps the dirtiest and least convenient craft which I have encountered, but of course we had to make the best of it. In the stern there was a little hutch of about 10 feet square, which was called the general cabin, and out of that, at the back, opened a kind of cupboard, which was labeled the ladies' room. It was, however, windowless, so that when the door was shut, it was in perfect darkness. This we resigned to Madame Blavatsky. Mr. Oakley, who was much fatigued and I think somewhat upset by the sudden change in our plans, threw himself down on the wooden hard seat at one side of the general cabin, while Mrs. Oakley and I, having regard to the army of enormous cockroaches, which was already in full possession of both cabins, preferred to spend the night in walking up and down the few yards of open deck, which gave us about 6 steps each way as the limit of our promenade. We paused occasionally to glance in at Mr. Oakley, but he slept on peacefully, although absolutely covered by the loathsome creatures already mentioned, and others. Oh my! Mrs. Oakley, who was a particularly fastidious person in ordinary life, was somewhat depressed, perhaps not unnaturally, so I did my best to comfort her with glowing pictures of the glory and beauty which I hoped were awaiting us in India. This went on for some hours until the monotony was suddenly broken by pitiful cries from Madame Blavatsky in her cupboard. Mrs. Oakley at once dashed in bravely, facing the insect plague with only a momentary shudder. But she found Mrs. Blavatsky very ill and in great pain and vehemently demanding conveniences which on that squalid little tugboat simply did not exist. Fortunately, our next stop was at the village of Kantara, the place where the pilgrim track from Cairo to Jerusalem crosses the canal, and we prevailed on the captain of our funereal craft to wait for us there for a few minutes. There was, of course, nothing in the nature of a gangway, nor even a wharf, but they produced something. They produced from somewhere a plank, an ordinary builder's plank, perhaps a foot in width, and Mrs. Oakley and I had to carry our unfortunate leader ashore by that means. In brackets, Mrs. Blavatsky at that time weighed 245 pounds. I know, because I weighed her myself on the butcher's steelyard on dock of the SS Navarino a few days later. You may imagine that it was nervous work, and Mrs. Blavatsky's language on that occasion was more conspicuous for strength than suavity. But somehow or other the feat was achieved, and we conveyed her safely ashore and back again on board a little later, which was an even more serious undertaking because of the pronounced upward slope of the plank. She was restored to her cubbyhole, and the heroic Mrs. Oakley sat beside her until she sank to sleep. I believe Mr. Oakley went to sleep again, but his wife, as soon as she could leave our leader, came and paced the deck with me until, in the pale gold of the Egyptian morning, we moored beside the wharf at Ismailia. There was an interval of some hours before our train started, so it seemed reasonable to go to the hotel and have some breakfast. There were at that time 2 hotels in the town, and their respective touts were vehemently pressing their claims on the wharf. Mr. Oakley, who was supposed to be the businessman of the party, made some sort of bargain with one of them. Madame Blavatsky, though still looking pale, was able to come on shore and walk slowly up and down the wharf, but she did not seem anxious for companionship, and in fact rather repelled it. We saw her exchange a few words with 1 or 2 officials and with the men from the hotels, and when a little later a dilapidated carriage drove up and we wished to start for the hotel, the 2 porters at once engaged in a savage fight over our luggage. When we called on the station master to interfere, it transpired that while Mr. Oakley had made an arrangement with one of these men, Madame Blavatsky had, meanwhile, engaged the other, and naturally, as she spoke in Arabic, we had no inkling of this proceeding on her part until the time came for our departure. So we had to go to the hotel which she had chosen, and to pacify the other unfortunate man as well as we could. Matters were sorted out eventually, and of course by bribing both parties to the quarrel. And at last we were allowed to depart in peace and partake of our breakfast. Poor Madame Blavatsky still suffered somewhat, but was evidently not in the best of humors. But she indignantly scouted the timid suggestion that we spend a day in Ismailia in order that she might recover her strength. So, in due course, we took our places in the train. As the journey continued, Madame Blavatsky gradually recovered her strength, and a little conversation arose, but it was distinctly colored by the influence of the previous night, for our leader favored us with the most gloomy prognostications of our future state. "Ah, you Europeans," she said, "you think you are going to enter upon the path of occultism and pass triumphantly through all its troubles. You little know what is before you. You have not counted the wrecks by the wayside as I have. The Indians know what to expect, and they have already passed through tests and trials such as have never entered into your wildest dreams. But you, poor feeble things, what can you do?" She continued these Cassandra-like prophecies with a maddening monotony, but her audience was far too reverential to try to change the subject. We sat in the 4 corners of the compartment, Madame Blavatsky facing the engine and Mr. Oakley sitting opposite her, with the resigned expression of an early Christian martyr, while Mrs. Oakley, weeping profusely and with a face of ever-increasing horror, sat opposite to me. For myself, I had a sort of feeling like putting up an umbrella against a heavy shower, but I reflected that after a good many other men had entered upon that path and had reached its goal, it seemed to me that even if I could not reach it in this life, I would at any rate lay a good foundation for the work of the next incarnation. Que sera, sera. In those prehistoric days, trains were usually lit by smoky oil lamps, and in the center of the roof of each compartment there was a large round hole into which the porters inserted these lamps as they ran along the roofs of the carriages. This being a day train, however, there was no lamp, and one could see the blue sky through the hole. It appeared that Mr. Oakley and I were both leaning back in our respective corners so that we both saw a repetition of the phenomenon which I had previously described as occurring in England. We saw a kind of ball of whitish mist forming in that hole, and a moment later it condensed into a piece of folded paper which fell to the floor of our compartment. I started forward, picked it up, and handed it at once to Madame Blavatsky, taking it for granted that any communication of this nature must be intended for her. She at once unfolded it and read it, and I saw a red flush appear upon her face. "Humph," she said. "That's what I get for trying to warn you people of the troubles that lie before you." And she threw the paper to me. "May I read it?" I said, and her only reply was, "What do you think I gave it to you for?" I read it, and I found it to be a note signed by Master Katumi, suggesting very gently but quite decidedly that it was perhaps a pity, when she had with her some earnest and enthusiastic candidates, to give them so very gloomy a view of a path which, however difficult it might be, was destined eventually to lead them to joy unspeakable. And then the message concluded with a few words of kindly commendation addressed to each of us by name. I'm sorry that I cannot be quite certain of the exact wording of that message, though I am sure that I have correctly reproduced its general tenor. The little sentence addressed personally to me was, "Tell Leadbeater that I am satisfied with his zeal and devotion." I need hardly say that we were both much comforted and uplifted and filled with gratitude, but though no rebuke could possibly have been more gently worded, it was evident that Madame Blavatsky did not altogether appreciate it. Before our conversation began, she had been reading some book which she wished to review for the Theosophist, and she was still sitting with her book open upon her knee and the paper knife in her hand. She now resumed her reading, stroking the dust of the desert which came pouring in at the open window off the pages of the book with her paper knife as she read. When an especially vicious puff came in, Mr. Oakley started forward and made a motion as if to close the window, but Madame Blavatsky looked at him balefully and said, with unmeasured scorn, "You don't mind a little dust, do you?" Poor Mr. Oakley shrank back into his corner like a snail into his shell, and not another word did our leader utter until we steamed into the station at Cairo. The dust certainly was rather trying, but after that one remark we thought it best to suffer it in silence. I remember that poor Mrs. Oakley was wearing one of those curious contrivances which ladies call a feather boa, and before we reached Cairo the whole thing was just a solid rope of sand, the feathers being indistinguishable. At Cairo we engaged a carriage and drove, as a matter of course, to the Shepherd's Hotel, that being the usual resort of English people. It would seem that some 30 or 40 other people had the same idea, for we found the great entrance hall crowded, and everything in dire confusion. Our luggage, of which we had a considerable amount, had been piled up upon the floor in the middle of the hall. Madame Blavatsky sat upon it, while Mr. Oakley was trying to fight his way through the crowd to the clerk's desk in order to engage rooms for us. He had barely succeeded in doing this. In fact, he was still struggling in the crowd on his way back to us, when she jumped up from her seat and called to him excitedly, telling him that we were not to stay at the Shepherd's at all, but instead we were to make our way to the Hotel D'Orient, which had been kept up by the Colombes during their stay in Egypt, the suggestion being that in that house we could acquire a good deal of information which would be of use to Madame Blavatsky when she came to deal with them later. Of course, this caused the usual confusion. Poor Mr. Oakley had to go back to the counter and countermand the rooms which he had engaged, and we made our way to the other hotel, which, though less fashionable, proved comfortable enough. It was the Izbikia Square. It was in the Izbikia, Ezbekieh Square, and we had some pleasant rooms overlooking the garden. We stayed there for several days, and the suggestion which had been made to Madame Blavatsky bore much fruit, and she was able to obtain from the present host and hostess of the hotel, and from some of the servants who had worked in the house for some years, numerous evidential details of unreliable and discreditable conduct on the part of previous occupants. It was in Madame Blavatsky's room in that hotel that I first saw one of the members of the Brotherhood. While sitting on the floor at her feet, sorting out some papers for her, I was startled to see, standing between us, a man who had certainly not entered by the door, which was straight before me the whole time, and had not opened. I jumped up, uttering a sharp exclamation of surprise, which caused Madame to laugh inordinately, and she said banteringly, "You will not go far on the path of occultism if you are so easily startled at a little thing like that." Then she presented me to the visitor, who proved to be he who is now the Master Duval Cool, although he had not then taken the initiation which made him an adept. Our stay in Egypt was in many ways a most remarkable experience, as Madame Blavatsky constantly told us much from the inner side of what we saw there. She had been in Egypt before and was well acquainted with some of the officials, including the Prime Minister, Nubar Pasha, who very kindly invited us all to dinner. She also seemed to know quite intimately the Russian consul, Monsieur Hitrovo, Hitrovo, who was exceedingly kind and attentive to her, sending her every morning a great bouquet of lovely flowers and treating her in every way as the lady of high distinction. And of course, she really was in her own country. Also, she introduced us to Monsieur Maspero, Maspero, the curator of the Bulak Museum, as it was then. I particularly remember how we went through the museum with this gentleman, and how Madame Blavatsky was able to give him a great mass of the most interesting information about various curiosities that were under his care. We saw many strange things, and it was, of course, an enormous advantage to us to have with us one who understood so well the Oriental customs and could explain the meaning of much that, without her, we could not have comprehended. I remember one day we were looking out the window of the hotel when we saw a number of men, obviously Mohammedans, gathered together in a circle in the garden of the square, all facing inwards. After some preliminary mutterings, they all began to go through some sort of exercise of extraordinary violence, raising their hands above their heads as high as they could reach, bending backwards as far as possible, and then swinging forward till the tips of their fingers touched the ground in front of them. And each time they made that convulsive swing, they all shouted in unison the name of God, Allah. This remarkable performance went on for about half an hour, and then, quite suddenly, they all executed a left turn, so that, although still standing in a ring, they were one behind the other. Then each put his hands on the shoulders of the man in front of him, and they began to run around in that ring, all barking in unison, exactly like dogs. This continued for perhaps 5 minutes, and then one of the men fell out of the circle and sank to the ground in a fit, struggling horribly and foaming at the mouth. In a few moments, all the rest were in the same condition, and the scene was most hideous. After a little while, one by one, they seemed to recover, and they sat up looking around in a dazed sort of way, and presently they helped one another to their feet and staggered away. But the extraordinary thing was that all the passers-by in that crowded street took the whole thing as a matter of course, and no one even stopped to watch these men, still less to offer any assistance. Madame Blavatsky told us that they belonged to a certain sect which made a practice of such a performance, and that by means of it they believed themselves to become possessed by certain spirits, from whom, while in that condition, they could obtain all sorts of useful information, such as, for example, where a buried treasure might be found, or that they could receive advice as to any difficulty in which they might happen to find themselves. She also described to us, in the most gruesome manner, the peculiarly ghastly and evil elemental creatures which gathered round themselves by this abominable ceremony. Madame Blavatsky understood Arabic, and she used to amuse us greatly by translating for our benefit the private remarks which were being made by the grave and dignified Arab merchants as they sat talking to one another in the bazaar. After they had for some time been calling us Christian dogs and speaking disrespectfully of our female relatives for many generations, she blandly asked them in their own language whether they thought that was a good way in which a good son of the prophet should speak of those from whom he hoped to gain much in the way of business. The men were always covered with confusion, not having expected that any European could possibly understand them. Arabic, however, seemed to have been the only Oriental language with which she was acquainted. She did not know Sanskrit, and many of the difficulties of our theosophical terminology arose from the fact that in those days she could describe what she saw or knew, and then ask any Indian who happened to be near what was the Sanskrit name for it. Very often the gentleman who provided her with the term had not clearly understood what she meant, and even when he did, we must remember that she asked adherents of different schools of philosophy, and that each answered according to the shade of meaning applied to the term in his teaching. Many curious phenomena were constantly taking place around her at this period. First, she was herself the most striking of all the phenomena, for her changes were protean. Sometimes the masters themselves used her body and wrote or spoke directly through her. At other times, when her ego was elsewhere engaged, one or another of her students of lower degree than herself would take the body, and there were even certain occasions when another woman used to be in charge, I think a Tibetan. I have myself frequently seen all these changes take place, and I have seen the new man who entered the body looking round to discover the condition of affairs into which he had come, trying to take up the thread of a conversation, for example. Yet, with all this, she was, in no sense of the word, like an ordinary medium, for the true owner of the body stood more or less within reach all the time, in full consciousness, and thoroughly understood what was going on. These amazing changes led sometimes to the most extraordinary complications. The cella, who was suddenly called in to occupy the body, was, of course, ignorant of what had been said a few minutes before, and so was occasionally betrayed into what seemed barefaced contradictions. I remember a story told to me later by a friend of the Avenue Road household, which gives a good illustration of the difficulties we had to encounter. The narrator was a man of some legal experience, and was consequently usually deputed to act as representative of the household or of Madame Blavatsky when there was any business to be done with the lawyers. On a certain day, some such business arose. I do not know its precise nature, but it involved the signing by Madame Blavatsky of several documents. Our member laid these documents before her, and endeavored with a true legal sense of responsibility to explain them to her, but she did not seem to comprehend at all clearly, and indeed pushed the papers aside somewhat impatiently. Having, as he supposed, obtained all the necessary signatures, He withdrew and was about to start his journey to the city, but finding the weather colder than he had expected, he decided to wear an overcoat and ran upstairs to his room to fetch it. Changing his papers from one pocket to another, he ran through them mechanically to see if they were all there, and fortunately he noticed that one of them was unsigned. So, on his way downstairs, he entered Madame Blavatsky's room, once more saying, "Oh, HPB, here is one of the papers that I've overlooked. Will you please sign it?" "What papers?" demanded Madame Blavatsky. "Only one more of those that you signed a few minutes ago." "What do you mean? I have signed no papers," she returned indignantly. "But HPB, here they are," protested the mystified member, and he spread them out before her. "Oh, I see," she said, apparently mollified. "But what is their purport?" Our friend repeated his explanations, and not only were they fully understood this time, but this Madame Blavatsky was a better man of business than he was, and asked him questions which he was unable to answer. No wonder that strangers did not always quite grasp the situation. I remember an occasion on which she bought in the scent bazaar at Cairo a tiny bottle of attar of roses, attar, of roses, for use in the shrine room at Adyar, paying £2 for it. When we were sitting at lunch in the hotel half an hour afterwards, at a small table reserved for our party in alcove, 2 English sovereigns fell out of space on the table. And Madame Blavatsky explained that she had been told that she ought not spend money upon them in this way, as we would need every shilling that we had before we reached Adyar, a statement which certainly proved true. At one time or another, I have seen a good many of the phenomena which were so closely associated with Madame Blavatsky. I have seen her precipitate drawings and writings. I have seen her find a missing object by occult power. On several occasions I have seen letters fall out of the air in her presence, and I must also state that I have seen such a letter fall at the headquarters at Adyar when she was 6,000 miles away in England, and again that I myself have several times had the privilege of being employed by the Master to deliver just such letters after her departure from the physical plane. In those early days of the Society, messages and instructions from the Masters were frequent, and we lived at a level of splendid enthusiasm which those who have joined since Madame Blavatsky's death can hardly imagine. Those of us who have had the inestimable privilege of direct touch with the Masters have naturally retained that enthusiasm. But it is not easy for us, whose powers are so much less than hers, fully to impart it to newer members. I have myself sometimes wondered, however, how many of our present-day members would have found themselves able to endure the somewhat severe but remarkably effective training through which she put her pupils. I can testify to certain radical changes which her drastic methods produced in me in a very short space of time, also to the fact that they have been permanent. When I came into her hands, I was just an ordinary lawn tennis playing curate, well-meaning and conscientious, I believe, but incredibly shy and retiring, with all the average Englishman's horror of making myself conspicuous in any way or occupying a ridiculous position. After a few weeks of her treatment, I had reached a stage in which I was absolutely hardened to ridicule and did not care in the slightest degree what anybody thought of me. I mean that quite literally. It was not that I had learned to endure disapproval stoically in spite of internal anguish, but that I actually did not care what people thought or said of me, and indeed never considered that matter at all, and I've never cared since. I admit that her methods were drastic and distinctly unpleasant at times, but there was no question as to their effectiveness. Apart from the great masters of wisdom, I've never known any person from whom power was so visibly radiated. from whom power so visibly radiated. Clever she certainly was, not a scholar in the ordinary sense of the word, yet, I've always said, possessed of apparently inexhaustible stores of unusual knowledge of all sorts of out-of-the-way, unexpected subjects. She was indefatigable worker from early in the morning till late at night, and she expected everyone around her to share her enthusiasm and her marvelous endurance. She was always ready to sacrifice herself, and for that matter, others also, for the sake of the cause of the great work upon which she was engaged. Utter devotion to her master and to his work was the dominant note of her life, and though now she wears a different body, that note still sounds unchanged. And if she should ever be directed to come forth from her retirement to take charge once more of the society which she founded, we shall find it ringing in our ears as a clarion to call around her old friends and new, so that through all the ages that work shall still go on. And that concludes chapter 6.